In 2021, escapologist Jonathan Goodwin attempted one of the most dangerous stunts ever filmed for America's Got Talent Extreme, but it went catastrophically wrong. Suspended in a straitjacket between two swinging cars rigged to explode, the timing malfunctioned and the vehicles slammed together with him still in between before he plummeted more than 30 feet to the ground. The impact severed his spinal cord, shattered both legs and shoulder blades, destroyed a kidney, and left him permanently paralyzed. He was airlifted from the set in critical condition, underwent multiple surgeries, and spent months hospitalized before being discharged in early 2022. Now confined to a wheelchair for life, Goodwin has described the incident as a miracle of survival. The next year, Goodwin filed a lawsuit against NBC Universal and others, accusing them of negligence, inadequate safety protocols, and a production that valued spectacle over human life. The filing claims the stunt was rushed, chaotic, and staffed by a team that lacked the necessary expertise, and that Goodwin will be wheelchair-bound for the rest of his life because of it. In 1996, 31-year-old Canadian man Blair Adams suddenly became convinced someone was trying to kill him. He abruptly withdrew his life savings, emptied his safety deposit box of gold, cash, and jewelry, and made several frantic but failed attempts to leave the country. After being denied entry to the US, he inexplicably abandoned his construction job in Vancouver, flew to Washington, D.C., rented a car, and began driving aimlessly across multiple states. Witnesses described him as paranoid and agitated, constantly checking over his shoulder and telling strangers someone was after him. Days later, his naked body was found in a Knoxville, Tennessee parking lot, his clothes torn and scattered around him, along with $4,000 in cash, gold, and jewelry, none of it stolen. An autopsy revealed he had sustained many cuts and abrasions consistent with a struggle, and a violent blow had ruptured his stomach, causing sepsis and eventually death. Yet there was no weapon found, no DNA evidence pointing to a killer, and his car keys were found tossed under a nearby vehicle. Hotel staff recalled him pacing in the lobby the night before as if waiting for someone. Nearly 3 decades later, Blair Adams' death remains one of the most baffling unsolved cases in North America. In 2010, 77-year-old rancher and hunting expert Don Alejo lived alone on a piece of land near Ciudad Victoria, Mexico, when a local cartel began demanding that he hand over his ranch, a common tactic in the region. They suddenly gave him 24 hours to vacate the property or be killed. Alejo told them he'd think about it, but instead, when the cartel left, he prepared for war. That night, he stayed up fortifying his home. He barricaded doors, moved furniture into firing positions, and set up multiple loaded rifles and shotguns at windows facing all approaches. At dawn, several cartel trucks rolled in expecting an easy takeover, but instead, the gunmen walked straight into a one-man ambush. From inside the house, Don Alejo opened fire with military-level precision. The firefight lasted nearly an hour, and by the time authorities arrived, they found 4 cartel members dead and at least 2 more critically wounded. The house was torn apart by gunfire, and Don Alejo was found inside, killed by return fire, still clutching his shotgun. Mexican Marines who processed the scene later said it was obvious he knew he wouldn't survive. He had prepared it as a final stand. Don Alejo's ranch was never taken by the cartel, and he became a national symbol of defiance in a region where most people are too terrified to fight back. In 2012, Florence Welch of Florence and the Machine nearly died from an undiagnosed ectopic pregnancy, which happens when a fertilized egg implants outside the uterus, usually in a fallopian tube, where it can't grow and can rupture suddenly, causing severe internal bleeding. She went on stage while bleeding internally, thinking it was normal pain, and later learned her fallopian tube had ruptured, leaving what doctors described as a Coke can's worth of blood inside her abdomen. She required emergency surgery to remove the tube and stop the internal bleeding. Florence later said it was the closest she's ever come to dying by far. In 2023, 16-year-old Bryce Brooks from Atlanta jumped into the ocean in Pensacola to save 4 younger kids he'd never met who were being pulled out by a strong rip current. He managed to help get them to safety, but the current dragged him under before he could escape. A family friend, 67-year-old Charles Johnson II, rushed in attempting to save Bryce but was also pulled under. The 4 children survived, but Bryce and Charles didn't make it, and both were later honored as heroes for sacrificing their lives to save others. In one of the most evil cases of betrayal ever recorded, a man from New Zealand secretly infected his wife with HIV using a sewing needle dipped in his own blood. After cheating on her and being diagnosed himself, he feared she would leave him. So while she slept, he pricked her leg, leaving only a tiny sting and a red mark. Months later, during a routine checkup, she tested positive for the virus and confronted him. He chillingly confessed, saying he only did it so she would be the same as me and would never leave. Prosecutors later called it an act of pure cruelty, and the man was sentenced to prison for willfully injecting another with a disease, a charge so rare that even the judge called it almost without precedent. Before he became famous, Vanilla Vanilla Ice claims he survived a brutal stabbing and a near-fatal nightclub attack. When he was 16, he got caught in the middle of a gang fight in South Dallas and was stabbed 5 times, one wound narrowly missing his heart. Doctors reportedly said the blade came so close that another half-inch would have killed him. Months later, he was nearly beaten to death outside a club after a show, leaving him with permanent nerve damage in his arm. This doll belonging to a 5-year-old girl has been watching over her gravesite since her death in 1912. In April of 2001, 20-year-old Branson Perry completely vanished from his father's home in Skidmore, Missouri. He told a friend he was stepping outside to put a pair of jumper cables into the shed, but was never seen again. His van, wallet, and all personal belongings were left behind. Despite searches, interviews, and 2 decades of investigation, no remains have ever been found and no one has ever been charged. To this day, Branson Perry's disappearance remains one of Missouri's most haunting unsolved cases. Victoria Wright was born with cherubism, a rare genetic disorder that causes the bones in the lower face to grow erratically, giving her a swollen, distorted appearance that drew cruel comments from strangers her entire life. The condition can be extremely painful by tightening the jaw, straining the facial nerves, and making basic things like chewing or even speaking very difficult at times. As a child, she endured constant looks, bullying, and even adults snickering about her in public as if she wasn't standing right there. But instead of hiding, she turned her diagnosis into a mission, calling out the cruelty she faced after a BBC documentary sparked a wave of online abuse and becoming a fierce advocate for people with facial differences. In 2015, Mary Cerruti vanished from her Houston bungalow without a trace. 2 years later, the new owners found her skeletal remains sealed inside a wall along with her glasses and shoes. Investigators believe she fell through the attic floor and became trapped, slowly dying alone in total darkness with no way of climbing out. But because she was one of the last homeowners refusing to sell as developers closed in around her, many people still suspect something darker. Her official cause of death remains undetermined. As a teenager, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson's family was struggling so badly that they were evicted from their apartment in Hawaii. Not long afterwards, Johnson witnessed something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His mother stepped out of her car on a busy highway and began walking towards oncoming traffic. Luckily, Dwayne sprinted after her and pulled her back just before she was hit. Years later, he revealed that the incident was a suicide attempt brought on by their dire situation, saying he never forgot how powerless he felt in that moment. In 2008, 39-year-old Stefan Miller was helping his cousin, Hollywood animal trainer Randy Miller, film a promo video with their 700-pound grizzly bear named Rocky, the same bear that starred alongside Will Ferrell in Semi-Pro that same year. But in an instant, the trained bear turned deadly. Without warning, Rocky suddenly lunged and bit deep into Stefan's neck, crushing his spine and severing an artery. He bled out within minutes as horrified crew members looked on. The bear, raised in captivity and for years considered to be safe, proved that even the most well-trained predator can revert back to its instincts in a heartbeat. He convinced her he was a 300-year-old werewolf, and it led to one of the most disturbing crimes in Canadian history. In 2006, 12-year-old Jasmine Richardson fell into a secret relationship with 23-year-old Jeremy Steinke, a self-proclaimed 300-year-old werewolf with a history of abuse, drugs, and violent fantasies. The pair openly talked about murdering people, even modeling themselves after natural-born killers. On the night of April 23rd, Steinke slipped into the Richardson home while high and drunk and stabbed Jasmine's mother 24 times, then brutally killed her father after telling him it's what your daughter wanted. Upstairs, Jasmine murdered her 8-year-old brother as he tried to defend himself with a toy lightsaber. Hours later, instead of hiding, the couple went to a party laughing, making out, and laughing about how her little brother gargled as he died. Arrested the next morning, Jasmine became Canada's youngest person ever convicted of multiple murders. She served the maximum youth sentence, had her record completely wiped in 2020, changed her name, and now lives in the community. While Steinke, now calling himself Jackson May, serves life with parole eligible in 2032. The murder of 6-year-old beauty queen JonBenet Ramsey is one of the most baffling cases in American history, and the details are far darker than most people realize. On Christmas night in 1996, her parents found a bizarre 3-page ransom note demanding $118,000, the exact amount of her father's recent bonus, written on paper from inside their own home. Hours later, JonBenet's father reportedly discovered her body in the basement, strangled with a homemade garrote made from one of her mother's paintbrushes, her skull fractured, and her wrists loosely tied as if staged. There are also signs of possible sexual trauma, suggesting she may have been assaulted before or after death. Meanwhile, the autopsy revealed partially digested pineapple in her stomach, even though her parents claimed she went straight to bed that night. A bowl of pineapple with her brother Burke's fingerprints was later found on the kitchen table. There were no footprints in the snow outside, suggesting the killer never entered or left the house. Police later learned the basement window was already broken and the family never fixed it. The most popular theory today is that JonBenet was accidentally killed by her older brother Burke during a sudden outburst, possibly over the pineapple, and that their parents staged the ransom note and crime scene to protect him. This theory, while never proven, explains many of the inconsistencies in the evidence. But despite massive media attention, DNA tests, false confessions, and countless theories involving intruders, cover-ups, and family secrets, no one has ever been charged. Nearly 30 years later, the case still remains unsolved. On Halloween morning in 2025, former TV news anchor Angie Mock was arrested in Wichita, Kansas, after allegedly stabbing her 80-year-old mother Anita to death inside their home. When police arrived, Mock was reportedly covered in blood with cuts all over her hands, while her mother was found deceased in bed with multiple stab wounds. Dispatch audio captured Mock claiming she stabbed her mother to save herself, though no evidence has yet explained what that meant. The once trusted newswoman, who had anchored for Fox 2 St. Louis, is now charged with first-degree murder and held on a $1 million bond. In 1998, Thai pop star Ruangsak Loichasak boarded Thai Airways Flight 261 and took seat 11A. Moments later, the plane crashed, killing 101 people on board, but Ruangsak miraculously survived, earning himself the nickname Iron Bones. Nearly 27 years later, history repeated itself when an Air India flight went down in 2025, and once again, the sole survivor was seated in 11A. Ever since, that seat number has become one of the fastest to sell out, since customers believe it will give them a higher chance of survival if the plane happens to crash. Her husband's disgusting secret drove her insane, and what she did next was pure horror. In 2020, 59-year-old Corinna Smith from Cheshire, England, learned that her husband Michael Baines had allegedly been sexually abusing their children for years. Enraged and unable to sleep, she boiled a pot of water, stirred in 3 bags of sugar to make it thicker and stickier, then poured the scalding mixture over him as he lay in bed. The sugar turned the water into a syrup that clung to his skin, causing burns so deep they exposed his flesh. Baines screamed in agony and survived for 5 excruciating weeks before succumbing to his injuries. Smith later told police she simply lost control after finding out what he'd done. She was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole in 12 years. In 1998, 21-year-old Matthew Shepard was lured from a Wyoming bar by 2 men who pretended to be his friends. They drove him to the edge of town, robbed him, and savagely beat him before tying him to a wooden fence and leaving him to die in the freezing wind. 18 hours later, a passing cyclist found him comatose and barely alive, his face so bloody that he was first mistaken for a scarecrow. Matthew had been pistol whipped and was beaten so brutally that his face was completely covered in blood, except for where it had been partially cleansed by his tears. The injuries were deemed too severe for doctors to operate, as Matthew died 5 days later from massive head trauma. Prosecutors argued the attack was fueled by robbery and deep-seated homophobia, something one of the killers later admitted to. Both men, Aaron McKinney and Russell Henderson, were convicted of felony murder and sentenced to life in prison while narrowly avoiding the death penalty. This was the final footage of Sandra Cantu before she was brutally murdered by someone everyone trusted. In 2009, 8-year-old Sandra Cantu vanished from her trailer park in Tracy, California after heading out to play. While police suspected a male predator who had touched Sandra before, the real killer was someone nobody expected. 28-year-old Sunday school teacher Melissa Huckabee, whose daughter was Sandra's friend. When Sandra went missing, Huckabee immediately inserted herself into the case, texting Sandra's mother strange messages about something being stolen at the exact time Sandra disappeared, and even claiming she found a note describing Sandra locked in a suitcase and tossed in the water. But witnesses had already seen her near an irrigation pond that same day, looking frantic and making a flimsy excuse that she had to pee before speeding off. Surveillance footage soon sealed her fate, showing Sandra walking toward Huckabee's trailer at 3:54 p.m. and Huckabee's SUV leaving the area just 8 minutes later. Police searched the church where she taught and found a rolling pin with a bent handle and a smear of Sandra's blood. Investigators believe Huckabee drugged Sandra, beat her up, sexually assaulted her with the rolling pin, then smothered and strangled her before stuffing the body into a suitcase and dumping it in the pond where it was recovered 10 days later. The seemingly trustworthy Sunday school teacher never explained why she killed her. Prosecutors suspect a twisted Munchausen-style urge for attention, someone willing to murder an innocent child just to make herself part of the tragedy. In one of the most disturbing cases ever shown on My Strange Addiction, a Tennessee woman named Casey developed a heartbreaking obsession after her husband Sean died suddenly from an asthma attack. Stricken with grief, she began carrying his urn everywhere, talking to it, sleeping beside it, and treating it like her husband was still alive. One day, when some of the ashes accidentally spilled on her hand, she instinctively licked them off, and soon enough became addicted to doing it deliberately. She admitted to eating the ashes up to 5 times per day, worried that if she ever stopped, she'd truly lose him forever. The ashes reportedly tasted like sand and rotten eggs, but she couldn't resist the rare feeling of closeness it gave her. Over time, she eventually consumed nearly a pound of her husband's remains, until appearing on the show finally made her realize how far her grief had gone. After filming, Casey entered therapy and eventually stopped consuming the ashes, keeping his urn nearby as a reminder of love rather than loss. On November 10, 1975, the SS Edmund Fitzgerald, one of the largest freighters to ever sail the Great Lakes, vanished without a single distress call. She was hauling 26,000 tons of iron ore across Lake Superior, a route sailors today still call the graveyard of the Great Lakes. As a brutal storm ripped across the lake, wind gusts reached hurricane force and waves rose over 30 feet. Nearby ships radioed that the Fitzgerald was taking whitewater over the deck, and her radar was down, vents smashed, and one of her lifeboats already torn apart by the waves. At 7:10 p.m., Captain Ernest McSorley made his final transmission, "We are holding our own." Minutes later, the 729-foot ship dropped off radar completely. When search teams managed to locate the wreck 2 days later, the bow was found buried more than 20 feet into the lake bed, showing how quick the ship plummeted through the water. The crew quarters were crushed flat, showing how violently the ship hit the bottom. So fast, the men never even reached their emergency stations. Divers later found crew hard hats still sitting neatly in their storage racks. All 29 crew members were lost, as not a single body was ever recovered. While the exact cause of the sinking still remains a mystery, many experts believe the Fitzgerald was struck by a rare Three Sisters, a set of massive rogue waves that can swallow a vessel in seconds, snapping the large ship in two and sending all 29 men to their graves 530 feet below the surface. In 1995, divers retrieved the ship's bell, the only piece ever brought to the surface, and replaced it with a memorial bell engraved with all 29 names. Every November 10th, it's rung 29 times, one toll for each life lost. Trailer Park Boys star Mike Smith, best known as the harmless wide-eyed Bubbles, has been charged with sexual assault in Nova Scotia for an incident that allegedly happened back in 2017, a case that stayed buried for nearly 8 years before finally surfacing in court. The identity of the victim is under a strict publication ban, but Smith is now legally barred from contacting them or going anywhere near their work, home, or school. The charge has forced him to step away from the Trailer Park Boys production company, tainting the wholesome persona millions have associated with him. Deep inside a sulfur-filled cave on the Albania-Greece border, scientists have uncovered the largest spiderweb ever recorded, an enormous 106-meter sheet stretched across the cavern's walls. Hundreds of thousands of spiders from 2 normally rival species have formed a massive cooperative colony, a terrifying behavior never before seen in spiders. The cave's toxic, sunless environment created a self-sustaining ecosystem powered by sulfur-eating microbes, which attracted swarms of insects, which in turn supplied this spider megacity with endless food. The web is so dense and vast, it looks like the cave is wrapped in ghostly white fabric, proof that life can evolve into something terrifyingly efficient when pushed into extreme conditions. Neil Peart, legendary drummer of the band Rush, lived through a series of devastating personal tragedies. In 1997, his 19-year-old daughter Selena died in a single-car accident while driving to college. Less than a year later, his wife Jackie succumbed to cancer, though Peart later described it as dying of a broken heart. To cope with the losses, he took a 55,000-mile motorcycle journey across North and Central America to cope with his grief. Though he eventually returned to music and remarried, Peart later died in 2020 after a private battle with brain cancer. In 1991, 25-year-old Gregory Green stabbed his pregnant wife to death and spent 16 years behind bars for the crime. After his release, he married the daughter of a pastor who helped him earn parole and started a new family in Michigan. But in 2016, history repeated itself in a scene far more horrifying. Green tied up his wife, shot her 2 children from a previous marriage, then poisoned and suffocated their 2 young daughters, ages 4 and 5. When police arrived, they found his children dead and his wife bound and bleeding in the basement. Green calmly surrendered, telling officers, "I just killed my family." He later pled guilty to 4 counts of murder and was sentenced to 100 years in prison, ensuring he'll never get a second chance again. In 2023, British TV presenter Holly Willoughby narrowly escaped a fate straight out of a nightmare. Her stalker, 36-year-old security guard Gavin Plum, had been secretly building what prosecutors called a murder kit in his Essex home. Ropes, metal cable ties, chloroform, and knives, all carefully organized for a late-night abduction. He spent over 18 months plotting every step, obsessively saving thousands of images of Willoughby, including hundreds of deepfakes he made to fuel his fantasies. Plum shared his entire plan with someone he met on a dark chat room called Abduct Lovers, where over 100 members spent hours trading violent fantasies. He even sent voice memos describing how they'd hit at night when traffic was low, and how he'd chloroform both of them, referring to Willoughby and her husband. But what he didn't know was that his online partner wasn't a killer, he was an undercover US federal agent. When British police stormed Plum's apartment, they found his computer filled with explicit material, detailed kidnap instructions, and surveillance notes about Willoughby's security routines. He knew her full schedule and had even written down what time she usually woke up. In July of 2024, Plum was sentenced to life in prison with at least 16 years before parole. Food influencer Michael Duarte, known online as Food with Bare Hands, built a massive following by grilling, cooking, and feeding strangers with his bare hands. But on November 8, 2025, his life ended in shocking fashion during a family trip to Texas. Police responded to a disturbance call involving a man reportedly acting erratically with a knife, and Duarte was fatally shot by deputies on the scene. Witnesses later described the moment as chaotic and heartbreaking, with his family present during the incident. The tragedy struck just 3 days after he and his wife celebrated their 9th wedding anniversary. In the immediate aftermath, Duarte's talent agency and family had presented his death via a GoFundMe campaign as a horrible accident, without initially disclosing police involvement. The family has since asked for privacy and support, as funeral arrangements are made and efforts to return his body to California proceed. Duarte was only 36 years old and leaves behind wife Jessica, daughter Oakley, and millions of fans who watched him turn simple meals into moments of kindness and generosity. Sports Broadcasting Hall of Famer Marv Albert, long known as the voice of basketball, was one of the most recognizable play-by-play commentators in NBA history. But in 1997, his career nearly collapsed after he was convicted of forcing a woman to perform oral sex on him. Evidence included bite marks matching his teeth and semen found at the scene. Another woman accused him of assault after arriving at his hotel room to find him wearing only silk panties and a garter belt. Albert pled guilty to assault and battery, was fired from NBC, and vanished from broadcasting, only to return less than 2 years later. Despite it all, he went on to call games for decades, still celebrated as one of the sport's most iconic voices. In 2007, 19-year-old Michael John Anderson from Minnesota lured a woman to his home using a fake Craigslist ad for a babysitting job. When 24-year-old Catherine Olsen arrived, he shot her in the back, dragged her bleeding body down a staircase, and stuffed her into the trunk of a car, which he later abandoned. When questioned, Anderson chillingly confessed that he killed her simply because he was bored and wanted to know what it felt like.